Good morning. Go ahead and turn your Bibles to 1 Kings. So we left off in chapter 18. While you're getting there, Sister Mary Sue handed me something, and I wanted to. Some of you may have already seen it. I had not. I guess I just hadn't seen this most recent issue yet. But House to House, Heart to Heart. This month, I think it's monthly now, if not bi-monthly. But anyways, this most recent issue, the cover article is "The Curse of Jericho," and we just happened to have talked about that last week in this class. So I thought that was pretty interesting timing. And he talks about this. I wonder. I haven't. Anyways, I've got the article. I'll look at it and read it. But Alan. He always writes, Alan Webster writes he's the editor and writes a lot of articles for House to House, Heart to Heart. But he always writes if I'm not mistaken, I've never seen anybody else but Alan writing the cover article. But he also has a tract on the curse of Jericho. But it looks like it's different if I remember that tract correctly. I haven't read it in a long time. But interesting. So just wanted to share that with you. We have extra copies of that if you want to. If you live in Bremen, of course, you will have that. But otherwise, we've got extra copies. Chapter 18 of 1 Kings. This is Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal there at Mount Carmel. I'm going to resist the temptation to park here and do a lot of preaching, and there's so much you can say about this, but I said to myself, I'm going to move through it a little quicker and spend time on the stuff that's maybe a little less familiar to us in the book of 1 Kings. But again, this is happening in the north. Ahab and Jezebel are steeped in idolatry. They are just impenitent, hard-hearted. We're going to hear later on in the book of 1 Kings, in fact, just a few chapters away, where the Bible is going to tell us that Ahab was stirred up by his wife Jezebel to do wickedness. In other words, the Bible is telling us, Ahab was not exactly a fine, upstanding man, but he would have been a lot better had he not been married to Jezebel. She certainly provoked him and encouraged him in a lot of wickedness. So Elijah has been told by God, you're going to present yourself to Ahab. Elijah tells, just lost my spot where we left off. Let's see. Verse 20, right? Elijah tells this prophet Obadiah that he's going to show himself to Ahab. Of course, Obadiah basically says, Elijah, I'm one of the good guys. Have you not heard how I've helped these prophets? I hid them from Ahab when he wanted to kill them, and he says, you tell me to go find Ahab and tell him you're here. I'm going to come back. God's going to call you to who knows where. And then Ahab's going to kill me because he's going to say I lied to him. And Elijah says, as the Lord liveth, I'm going to speak to him today. So Obadiah, he acts on faith. By the way, this is not obviously Obadiah the prophet, who author of the human penman for the minor prophet book called Obadiah. Different Obadiah. So he goes, and again, he's acting on some faith there because, he's worried about this. He's concerned, well, what if I go and get Ahab and then he comes back and Elijah's not here? But of course he goes, and Ahab comes to meet him, and, he says, art thou he that troubleth Israel? Well, the troubler of Israel was not Elijah. It was Ahab and his idolatry, Ahab and Jezebel and their idolatry. So he sends to the children of Israel, gathered the prophets together to Mount Carmel. That's at verse 20. And he asked them that famous question. That was one of the great questions of the Old Testament we studied this summer for our summer series. How long halt ye between two opinions? He says, look, make a decision. Get off the fence. If Jehovah is God, then follow him and put away the idols. But if the idols are God, if they truly are real, then stop calling yourselves Jehovah's people and put him away and serve your idols. Pick a side. You've heard the illustration used before. The man in the Civil War, he didn't really want to pick a side. So he wore, top Union colors, bottom Confederate colors, and what happens? He gets shot at from both sides, right? And so Elijah says, pick a side. You need to decide. It kind of reminds us of Laodicea. What was it? What was the problem with Laodicea? Yeah, they weren't hot. They weren't cold. And isn't that interesting? I mean, God says, I'd rather you be cold than to be lukewarm. And he says, make a decision. So that's what Elijah is saying here. How long halt you between two opinions? He says, you got to pick a side. So Elijah says, he's going to say this again later on, by the way. I, even I only, remain a prophet of the Lord. Which, was that true? No, it wasn't true. He felt that way. And sometimes, there are times when we begin to get down. And sometimes even, I was listening recently to a lesson from PTP. I don't know, it wasn't this year. I think it's been a year, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. But getting over into chapter 19, and this fellow, he was a licensed counselor, and he said that, best he can tell, when you get to 1 Kings 19, Elijah is what we would call clinically depressed. And one of the things that will sometimes happen in a situation like that is you begin to feel like, you are all alone. And Paul deals with this in 1 Corinthians 10, and he's talking about how Moses is up on the mountain. Joshua is halfway up the mountain. It's 1 Corinthians 10, but he's looking back, of course, to when Moses was on the Mount of Sinai receiving the law. Moses is up there on the mountain. Joshua, he went about halfway or so up the mountain and waited. And the people are down there, and they feel like we're all alone. Moses isn't coming back. And where is God? God's up there dealing with Moses. He's giving Moses the law, and they just kind of feel like we're all alone. And so Aaron says, bring me your gold. And they fashion this calf. Here are your gods, O Israel. Here's the God that delivered you from Egypt. But it all stemmed from them feeling like they were alone, right? And that's why in 1 Corinthians 10:12, Paul says, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. It's really what we would call an elliptical statement, an ellipsis. I think that's the word I'm looking for. Not, I think elliptical works too, but ellipsis is, I think, the noun form of it. But it's, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth alone take heed lest he fall. When you think you stand alone, you are very, very susceptible to falling. And that's what happens with Elijah. And you already see a little bit of it here in chapter 18, because he's saying to the people, hey, I'm the only one. I wonder if there might have been anybody in that crowd who was still faithful, who's kind of going, oh, you're not? I'm faithful too. But that's how he's feeling. He says, Baal's prophets are 450 men. He's also drawing a contrast between the 1 and the 450. Let them give us 2 bullocks. Let them choose 1 bullock for themselves, cut it in pieces, lay it on the wood. I'll dress the other. He says, you call in the name of your gods, and I'll call upon the name of Jehovah. And the God that answers by fire, verse 24 says, let him be God. People said, it's well spoken. Sounds like a plan. That sounds like a good way to settle this thing. So Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, go ahead and choose. You go first. And you call in the name of your gods. He says, you're many, you go first. So they do. They take their bullock and they dress it, and they call upon the name of Baal from morning till noon. And they're crying out, oh, Baal, hear us. There's no voice, of course, nor any that answered. They leaped upon the altar which was made. Then at noon, Elijah begins to mock them. Now, he's not just trying to be a smart aleck. He's making a point here. He's not just simply trying to be rude, but he's making a point. And he says, hey, cry louder. Maybe he can't hear you. Maybe Baal's a little bit hard of hearing. Or he says, maybe he's busy. Maybe he is talking. He's tied up in conversation with somebody. So cry a little louder. Maybe he's pursuing or in a journey. He's got other things going on. Maybe if you cry a little bit louder, he'll hear you and come to your aid here. Oh, or maybe he's asleep. Maybe you need to cry out a little bit louder to wake him up. I mean, he is a little bit. I don't think he's just trying to be a jerk is what I'm saying. But Yeah, he is. He is definitely. He's definitely driving home a point here, and he's using some. Yeah, I mean sarcasm, and sarcasm is, there's a place for it, and Paul will sometimes use sarcasm. You know, you want to be wise with that, but it does show that, and it's a powerful point here. He's saying, and it does. It helps. It's driving their focus, you know, that it's not working, and it's like he's saying to the people. You can almost see him turning to the audience and saying, maybe they're not crying loud enough, folks. Come on, prophets, a little bit louder. Wake him up. And so, I mean, I do. I guess that's a good point. Point well made. He is being a little bit smart with a purpose, and he's making the point, and it's also directing everyone there, and of course throughout all time because it's recorded in the Bible, to the fact that these gods, they're not answering. They're not going to answer because they're nothing. There are no gods. There is one God, Jehovah. So, he tells them, and boy, they really get wound up. They cry out. They start cutting themselves after their manner, knives and lancets, till the blood gushed out upon them. It's almost like, and it's amazing how far away from the God of heaven people can go. It's this idea that if I hurt myself, that'll somehow make God happy. What kind of God are you serving that loves it and he's going to listen to you more because you just gash yourself and start bleeding? Oh, there you go. He's going to, and you can trace some of this back, all the way back. It's mankind started off in the garden, Adam and Eve, and as people spread over the face of the earth, they start corrupting true worship. But there is something there to the blood. Because what does the Hebrews author tell us in Hebrews 9:22? Without shedding of blood, there's no remission. But God doesn't want you shedding your own blood. He's not saying you need to be cutting yourself. It's fruitless anyways, because my blood, your blood, can't atone for a single sin. He did tell them to offer animal sacrifices, but as we often use that illustration, it's rolling sins forward until the blood of Jesus Christ, and the blood from the cross, we sometimes say, flows forward, but it also flowed backward to cover those faithful under the old covenant. But they've gotten so corrupted here, and Paul details some of this in Romans 1, how when you become corrupt, it's a slippery slope. So they're cutting themselves, knives, lancets, blood's gushing out upon them. When midday is past, they prophesy till the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. Of course, there's no voice, nor any to answer, nor any that regarded. And Elijah says to all the people, come near unto me. It's almost like when it's his turn, Elijah says, hey, everybody, gather in. Come a little closer. I want everybody to make sure you got a good look at what's going to happen here. He's about to make a strong point, really God is, through Elijah. So he says, come near, and of course they do. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down, takes 12 stones, according to the number of the 12 tribes, and with the stones, he built an altar. And then he puts the wood in order. He cuts the bullock in pieces. And he says, fill 4 barrels with water and pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood. Now, this is one of those passages I had studied for, I don't remember exactly when I ran across this or was made to think about this, but I had studied it for easily 30 plus years before. But what's very interesting about this, I think we've mentioned it before, this particular verse, 33 I'm talking about. Do what? Yeah, I mean, he tells them to pour 4 barrels of water, and what's significant about that? Yeah, they're in a 3.5-year drought. I don't know where they got it, but I can guarantee you it was scarce at this point. 3.5 years of drought. Maybe they're importing it from somewhere. Maybe the king is paying a very heavy price for that. But it's there, and he says, take 4 barrels. I wonder, the text doesn't tell us, but can you just imagine some of those people going, what did you say? Because number one, what's he preparing to kindle on the altar? Fire. Fire and water, they don't play nice together. So you want us to take water in a 3.5-year drought, pour it on the altar where you're supposed to be starting a fire to offer a sacrifice. Did we understand that correctly, Elijah? Are you sure? Is that what you meant to say? Elijah says, yes. Not only that, I want you to pour 4 of those barrels. I wonder what they cost per barrel at that point, what the financial value was. But yeah, he says, that's right, 4 barrels. And so they say, okay, and they do. And then Elijah says, hey, again. Again? Are you sure? Do it again. And then he says, a 3rd time. Can you imagine? Most of the people are probably like, this poor guy has lost his mind. I don't know if Hebrews ever said bless his heart, but if they did, they'd be saying it right there, right? Bless his heart. He has lost his mind. Whatever. And Ahab's just thinking, oh, yeah, oh boy, you just use all the water you want because I got you now. You're cornered here on Mount Carmel, and when this is all said and done, I'm going to have you. You almost picture Ahab just saying, have your fun. Or maybe Ahab knew what was going to happen because Ahab knew better than what he was doing. So I don't know. I don't know what was going through his mind. But anyways, the water ran around the altar, verse 35, and it filled the trench with water. So you have an altar with 12 stones, wood is on it, the bullock has been dressed, and it's ready for the offering, but it's all completely 100% soaked to the point that this trench around the altar is now filled with water. So at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, there was a morning sacrifice and evening sacrifice under the law. So this is the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. Elijah the prophet came near and said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel, let it be known this day that thou art God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that I have done all these things at thy word. He's not acting of his own accord. He's not trying to show out. Look at me, I'm so powerful. Hey, everybody, come see a prophet in action. He says, no, I'm doing what God is telling me to do. Hear me, O Lord. Hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. There's no crying over and over. There's no cutting. There's no blood, at least Elijah's blood. The fire of the Lord fell, verse 38, and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones. You ever try to burn stones? This fire did. And the dust. And licked up the water that was in the trench. And I'm going to tell you, this was such a sight that the people fell on their faces. They were terrified. I have an idea. I've seen an artist rendering of this before, and it was pretty impressive, and it was kind of how I picture it in my mind. This was not it burst into flames, I have an idea. This was like a massive amount of fire that came from the sky. It says it fell, so I think this came from the sky, clearly. I don't think it popped up from the wood or whatever into flames. This came down upon the altar, and the rendering I saw some artist had drew, I think it was a painting. It was like this huge pillar of fire just came down. And that's what I picture here. I do know it was so terrifying, the people fell on their faces. Anytime in the Bible you read about somebody falling on their face, it's either someone who, it always involves fear. Now, it might be a reverential fear. Sometimes somebody comes before the king and they bow, down on their face. But you see this a lot. You see it sometimes. We're studying Revelation on Wednesday nights, and sometimes you see this with John. Some of the visions he'll see, he's terrified. Not necessarily in the sense of he thinks God's going to hurt him or something, or the angel's going to hurt him, but it's such a magnificent and awe-inspiring type of scene. He falls on his face. These people, they're face first on the ground. And what are they crying out? The Lord, He is, what's that article? The God. The Lord, he is the God. It's interesting. If I'm not mistaken, I had to go back and do some research on this, but I don't have this in my notes, and I'm going based on memory. If I'm not mistaken, the name Elijah means the Lord, he is God. And if so, then what they're saying here sounds something like Elijah, Elijah. Not that they're praising Elijah, but it would have been an interesting scene for sure. The Lord, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God. Unfortunately, you read this, and man, it just, every time I read it, I don't know. I don't know about you, but this is one of those, again, I have studied it I don't know how many times. I've preached on it. I've taught classes on it. It just kind of gets my blood pumping every time. I can't imagine this scene. This is, I sometimes tell people, there are things we don't know for sure, but I sort of wonder and hope that one day in heaven that maybe we can just ask the Lord at will, at random, and say, God, I want to see 1 Kings 18. I want to be there and see it. And God can just make that happen where you can see it, not just picturing it in your mind, but you see it as it would have happened. I mean, could God make that happen for us? Obviously. There's nothing in the Bible that says, hey, in heaven you can ask God to show you any scene you want from the Bible, but maybe. There's certainly nothing that would rule that out. I would love to see this, because every time I read it, I get excited. But it's also kind of like, I get where Elijah's coming from in chapter 19. Because it's like, here's this scene and they're shouting, the Lord, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God. And how long is that going to last? Not very long. I think most of us in here were alive for September 11th, 2001, if not all of us. And one of the things I remember from that day is, Congress standing out on the lawn, singing, God Bless America. And I remember, I was a member at Panama Street in Montgomery at the time. I was living down there and working in Montgomery. And I remember how many more people showed up even for our little congregation there. And all over the place, people were talking about how many people were in churches. And, you'd even hear some people, especially I heard a lot of denominational folks talking about folks rededicating their lives to Christ and people accepting Jesus and all this stuff. And how long did that last? I mean, it was not very long. And that's kind of what I think of when I think of this. It's encouraging in one sense and gets your blood pumping to see such an impressive display, but it was short-lived, unfortunately. So he says, take the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. This is a judgment upon them from God. It's not Elijah just being mean. These were idolatrous people. They led the people in idolatry. They encouraged the people in idolatry. They actually went through with the act of worshiping the idols. And so they are being judged. This was a capital crime, by the way, under the law of Moses. So Elijah says, don't let one of them escape. So they take them, brought them down to the brook Kishon, slew them there. Elijah said unto Ahab, get up, Ahab, eat and drink, for there is a sound of abundance of rain. Perhaps this is why Ahab doesn't just seize him right there. Maybe he's still very taken with the whole scene that just unfolded before his eyes. But he says, you better go. And so Ahab went up to eat and to drink. Elijah went up to the top of Carmel, and he cast himself down upon the earth, put his face between his knees. I don't know if this is this may have been a very exhausting episode for Elijah as well. This may be kind of the adrenaline wears off, and you just sort of, if you've ever been in a situation like that. And so maybe he just sort of slumps down, face between his knees, and he sort of says to his servant, I'm telling you Chad's opinion here. This is not in the text. But I just sort of almost picture Elijah still with his face between his knees there, and he's spent. And he sort of says to his servant without even looking up, go, look toward the sea. And the servant, of course, goes, looks, says, there's nothing. And he said, go again. There's nothing, Elijah. Go again. Still nothing, Elijah. Of course, this happened 7 times. Again, I don't know if he looked up or not. It doesn't tell us, but I just sort of wonder, picturing and looking at the context and Elijah's mindset right now and feeling very depressed. And 7 times. The 7th time he goes, and he says, there arises a little cloud out of the sea like a man's hand. And he says, go tell Ahab, prepare your chariot and get down, that the rain stop thee not. It may be that originally the whole shock of everything that happened had Ahab's attention, and maybe now God is using this to providentially, without even using a miracle, maybe God is using this rain coming. Elijah says to Ahab, you better get down before while you still can, because there's a massive rain coming, and you're going to be, you're going to be slogging through the mud if you don't get on down to your house. And so Ahab says, well, better go. I'll deal with Elijah later. Or maybe he's excited that it's going to rain. I don't know. But anyways, he goes. And the heaven was black with clouds and wind. Verse 45, there was a great rain. Ahab rode and went to Jezreel. The hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. Again, this is one I read sometimes, and I wonder maybe there is something miraculous going on here to help spare Elijah. Ahab is left of his own, but, Elijah ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. And this may not necessarily be in chronological order. It may be that, all this happens with the rain cloud, and this is happening pretty soon after the fire had come down from heaven. And then he says, hey, Ahab, rain's coming. You better get down the mountain. And then he's gone. And Ahab's tied up with thinking about the rain. And so Elijah gets away. But anyways, we know whether providentially or miraculously God is involved in protecting Elijah. So Ahab told Jezebel. Apparently she was not there. I don't know why, but it seems like she wasn't there. He says everything Elijah had done, and with all how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. And Jezebel says, well, isn't that wonderful? We need to turn and get our lives right, Ahab. No, she doesn't say that. She says, so let the gods. She's still steeped in her idolatry. So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life, talking about Elijah, she sent a messenger to him to tell him that. If I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time, you just let me find you, Elijah, and I'm going to teach you a lesson. Those were my boys. Those were my prophets. They worked for me. You killed my people. I'm going to make you like one of them. And when he saw that, talking about Elijah, he arose and went for his life, came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, left his servant there. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, came and sat down under a juniper tree. He just says, I'm done, Lord. Just go ahead and kill me now. It's enough. For I'm not better than my fathers. Talking about his fathers, other prophets who have suffered at the hands of wicked people, been martyred, we would say. Just take my life, Lord. You ever feel that way? It's enough. I've had enough, God. I'm tapping out, we sometimes say. That's what Elijah says here. I'm tapping out. Just take my life, Lord. So he lays down and he sleeps. And, to me, there's a lot of encouragement in this passage because, who hasn't felt that way at some point in your life where you just kind of feel like I am tapped out, I'm spent. God, could you just take me now? You ever just feel like, I wish in some sense I could just be done right now and go to heaven. Elijah knows heaven's his home. It's like, I don't want to do this anymore, God. God doesn't come to him and say, you worthless, get up, you lazy bum. He doesn't come and start chiding him. Now, hey, he's gonna have a plan for him. But you know what it says he does? He took a nap. Sometimes when you feel that way, you might just want to take a nap. Sometimes you can't, right? But he lays down and he slept. And, I wonder, again, text doesn't tell us, but I wonder if with all this going on, he may not have slept in a long, long time. But he lays down and he sleeps under the juniper tree. And then an angel touched him and said, arise and eat. Sometimes we get depressed, we don't eat. I get depressed, I eat more. But sometimes people get depressed and they don't eat, right? He says, you need to eat something, Elijah. He looked, and behold, there was a cake baking on the coals, and a cruse of water at his head, and he did eat and drink, and he laid down again. I mean, he's in a bad shape here emotionally, mentally right now. The angel of the Lord came again the second time, touched him, and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. I wonder what Elijah thought when he heard that. The journey is too great for thee. Didn't you hear me, Lord? I'm done. Take me now. What journey? I am done. But he arose, he ate, drank, when the strength of that meat, 40 days and 40 nights. And where does he go? Where does God take him to or lead him to? Horeb. We also know that mount as Mount Sinai. Isn't that interesting? That's a pretty significant place to be, isn't it? Especially for a Jew. He goes 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. Now, there's a lot of time passing here in the text. It's just rolling with it. But 40 days and 40 nights, and every indication is he's going 40 days and 40 nights on that one meal. So he came to a cave, and he lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him and says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And, it's interesting. Elijah doesn't say, well, you brought me here to Mount Horeb. He says, I've been very zealous, we would say, for the Lord of God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down that altar, slain thy prophets with the sword. Even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Again, God doesn't say immediately, Elijah, wise up, man. Open your eyes, man. You're not the only one. Now, he is going to tell him that later, very gently. But God says, hey, go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. Sinai was kind of known to a Jew as a place of meeting with God. The Mount of Meeting. Sometimes they even refer to that. So he said, go stand upon the mount. So the Lord passed by. A great strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Isn't this amazing? I wonder, is this happening just for Elijah or people in the surrounding region? I mean, the mountain was rent. And then there's an earthquake. Again, the text just doesn't tell us, so it's pure speculation. But can you imagine if you live, 5, 10, 15 miles away, all of a sudden there's this massive earthquake? What is going on? And then you find out later it's God dealing with Elijah. But then after the fire, there's this still small voice, and, God wasn't in all these big things. He's making a point to Elijah. Sometimes people go crazy with this still small voice thing. But he's making a point to Elijah. Sometimes God is in the seemingly smallest things. You might expect this raging fire, and that's got to be God coming to me and speaking to me, and God's not in the fire. The earth shakes. That's got to be God. God's not in that. The mountain is rending, and this wind and this tempest. That's not God. There's just a still small voice. And of course the voice, when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out, stood in the entering in of the cave. The voice says again, what are you doing here, Elijah? He says it again, look, I've been zealous for the Lord God of hosts. I only am left. And the Lord says, and again, notice what God does not say here. You know what God is not saying? Oh, Elijah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you're having a bad day. Let me see what I can do to make you feel better. Sometimes one of the best things when we're getting a little bit self-pitying, and we're even, I realize sometimes there are things that go on chemically and that I can't help, but I'm talking about when we're just getting down. I'm not talking about necessarily being having a chemical imbalance and dealing with depression in that sense. But one of the best things many times we can do is what? Get up and get busy. And sometimes that's not easy. I'm not saying that's the easiest thing to do, but sometimes it's one of the best things you can do. God says, go. Little bitty word, but there's a lot in that, isn't there? He says, go, Elijah. I'm not putting you out to pasture yet. Go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you come, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. You're going to go anoint a new king for Syria? Which is interesting because that's a heathen nation, right? Remember, the Old Testament focuses on the Jewish nation for one reason. And it ain't because God loved them more than anybody else. It ain't because God was only interested in them. Why does the narrative focus always on the Hebrew people, the Jewish people? The Messiah is coming through the nation of Israel. But God is not uninterested in those Gentiles. He says, you're going to go anoint another king over Syria, who's going to turn out to be wicked. But he had a choice in the matter. God anointed him to be king. He wanted him to follow him, but unfortunately he doesn't. Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel. There's going to be a new sheriff in town in Israel, Elijah. Ahab is just like any other ruler, just like any other human. He's going to live, he's going to die, and he's going to face God in the judgment. And he says, oh, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah, I should have Billy read that verse for me, shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. And it shall come to pass that him that escapeth the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay, and him that escapeth from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay. Yet, and this is where God says, P.S., yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him. When you get to the New Testament, there's a word for worship, proskuneo, and it means to kiss toward. It's the idea of, and you'll see this in Psalm 2, kiss the Son lest he be angry. It's the idea of worshiping. It's a prophecy of the Son of God, but it's the idea of kissing toward. It was like how they would worship many times, kissing that offering. And so he says, 7,000 knees have not bowed to Baal, every mouth which has not kissed him. So he departed thence and found Elijah the son of Shaphat, who was plying with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother. And this is not in the sense of worship. This is just saying, let me go say goodbye. Then I will follow thee. He turns back and says, for what have I done to thee? And he returned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slew them and boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen and gave them to the people. And they did eat. Then he arose and went after Elijah and ministered unto him. It's interesting. He's here with other people. It's not just him. He's plying with the 12th yoke of oxen. But he takes the yoke of oxen, his yoke, and what does he do? He kills them. He prepares them. And he uses the wood from the cart and the yoke and all this. And he offers. Boils them. Gave it to the people, rather. It's not really what we call an offering. He's boiling and giving it to the people. But I think that's pretty interesting, isn't it? Sometimes they would ask us as preacher boys in the preaching school, did you burn your threshing, your sowing and reaping instruments when you came to school? Did you kill the oxen? The illustration is given of Cortez when he went to conquer and he burned the ships so that his soldiers couldn't try to turn back. What about when we become a Christian? Some people, they don't kill the oxen and burn everything, do they? They say, well, I want to save myself just in case I want to go back to that old way of living. Burn your oxen. What's the song? I have decided to follow